Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on June 15th, 2023. And this week we're talking about a pitcher for the Toronto Blue Jays who shared a social media post that was deemed offensive to LGBTQ promoters and supporters. Not long after, he was coerced into making an apology and then was cut by the team. For many in our culture, promoting biblical standards of sexuality and gender is an unforgivable sin. So we're going to talk about that in our episode today. For links to the story we're talking about, as well as other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/061523. Now for our story this week. Blue Jays cut Christian pitcher after he voices support for Target boycott and quotes the Bible. From Christian Headlines, a Toronto pitcher who sparked controversy with comments about Target and LGBT Pride Month has been cut from the team. The pitcher, Anthony Bass, is an outspoken Christian who shared a video on Instagram in May that quoted Bible verses and supported conservative-led boycotts of Target and Bud Light. The video labeled the company's stances on certain issues evil and demonic. The post quoted Ephesians 5:11, "Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them." Bass apologized and removed the video, but in a follow-up interview, he said his personal beliefs on the issue had not changed. The Blue Jays last week designated him for assignment, a baseball term that means he has been immediately cut from the team's roster. A different Major League Baseball team could still pick him up. Toronto General Manager Ross Atkins acknowledged that the comments played a role in releasing Bass. It's not often that I get to talk about baseball here on the podcast. In fact, this is probably the only time that I've ever been able to do this. But this is a story that I thought we should talk about, and not just because it involves baseball. Recently, we have seen some pretty effective boycotts against companies like Target and Bud Light due to their support for the transgender movement. And this pitcher, Anthony Bass of the Toronto Blue Jays, shared a social media post, as we just read in that story, that was in favor of those boycotts. He was forced to apologize and then coerced into participating in the team's Pride weekend festivities. But now he has been designated for assignment, which is a fancy baseball term that means he's been cut from the team's roster. There are 3 points that we're going to consider here in our episode today. Number 1, from a baseball perspective, this move to cut Anthony Bass from the Blue Jays roster was not unreasonable. For those who are not baseball fans, bear with me for just a couple of minutes while I briefly talk about some baseball statistics and roster management. And I will keep this brief, and I promise I do have a point in talking about this. So I wanted to highlight some statistics for this pitcher, for Anthony Bass. First is that he is 35 years old. For a Major League Baseball player, someone who is of that age is generally near the end of his career, especially if they are average or below average as a player. He also, this season, has an ERA of 4.95 in 22 games. Now, for those who are not familiar with what that means, an ERA stands for an earned run average. It's the average number of earned runs, and if you don't know the difference between earned runs or unearned runs, then you can look that up. I'm not going to take the time to explain it here. But it's the average number of earned runs that a pitcher allows per 9 innings. It is the simplest metric to evaluate the performance of a pitcher in baseball. And his ERA is at 4.95 is not great. It's not terrible, but it's also not that good. Last year, he had an ERA of 1.54. Anything under 2 is very good. So his performance from last year to this year has dropped off significantly. And in terms of his earned run average, this was the worst year that he's had since 2017. And not only that, but a team only has so many roster spots. If they have better players who maybe have been injured but are returning from injury and need to be back with the team, or they have the ability to call up players from the minor leagues that they think can contribute at a higher level than he is currently contributing. And I don't follow the Toronto Blue Jays, so I don't know if that's the case or not. But if it is the case, then it wouldn't make sense to hold on to an aging, declining relief pitcher who has only pitched a total of 20 innings this season. So why do I bring up these baseball statistics? So for those who are not interested in baseball or not baseball fans, this is why I'm talking about this. It is important, I believe, to understand basically what's going on here before we immediately claim that this is some form of persecution over his biblical views on sexuality or gender. Now, I'm not saying that this is not some type of persecution, but before we make that case, it's good to be aware, at least, of the plausibility that this was purely a decision that was made from a baseball perspective, from a team who just wants to win games. Now, personally, and this is coming from someone who is a baseball fan and has been for all of my life, I think the timing of this is a little bit too convenient to say that this was only a baseball decision. I think his comments, and the general manager of the Blue Jays also hinted at this, that his comments did play a role in this. But for those who understand these statistics and the performance of the pitcher, it's not out of the question that the team might cut him from the roster at this time. A second point that I want us to think about here is that this was about the social media post that he shared was about the boycotts that were going on. I want to think a little bit about these boycotts and want us to consider the fact that boycotts are not always going to be the answer or the best way to approach things like this. From time to time, we'll hear about certain people or certain groups boycotting a particular company over some issue. Might be labor issues, might be unethical business practices, or it might be because the company or the leadership in that company donates to causes or groups or political candidates that they choose to support that other people just don't like. And boycotts are done by people from a wide range of ideologies and worldviews. It's not limited to those who are conservative or those who are liberal. All sorts of different people participate from time to time in boycotts like this. And most boycotts really don't seem to accomplish much because there aren't enough people participating in the boycott, or the company that's being boycotted just doesn't lose enough revenue for it to really matter to them. However, recent boycotts of the retail chain Target and the alcoholic beverage Bud Light have been very costly for those companies. Enough people were upset over their support of transgender ideology to make that happen. Target in particular made a lot of people upset over their targeting of children and catering to parents who are intent upon pushing gender confusion on their kids. And while the New Testament doesn't directly address boycotts like these, it does address something similar. First century Christians eating meat that was sold in the marketplace that had previously been used in idol worship. On one hand, Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. Paul explains here that since these idols are not real, those who recognized that fact had the liberty, as he used that word in verse 9 of that chapter, They had the liberty to eat this meat without acknowledging or honoring that so-called God that this was being offered to. And Paul explained to the Romans that this fell under the category of personal opinion. Romans 14 verses 2 and 3, he said, "One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him." So Paul's point is that since someone could eat meat and someone else could not eat meat, and both of them could be accepted by God, then Christians were to accept one another despite holding different opinions. And I believe for most boycotts, this principle would apply. It's a matter of personal conviction and what you can support in good conscience. We may come to different conclusions, but we can still accept one another. Now, on the other hand, Paul also said this: "Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord and all it contains. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, 'This is meat sacrificed to idols,' do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake." In that case, it was being presented in such a way that eating the meat implied support for the sinful practice. When that happened, Paul said, don't eat that meat. Don't eat what is presented to you so as not to show support for the idolatrous practice. There may be a difference between buying a product from some company and then somewhere along the line, some of the money that that company earns trickles down to a political candidate that supports immoral or unbiblical policies or something like that. There may be a difference between that and buying from a company that is openly attacking biblical values and using you as a customer to proclaim support for their godless ideology. And that could be what's happening with these boycotts that are going on now. Those are just some things to think about when it comes to boycotts. But then the third point, and this was really the main point that I wanted to address here in our episode today, is that a pro-LGBTQ majority will never tolerate a Christian minority. For a long time, advocates of homosexuality and transgenderism, though mostly it's been homosexuality because transgenderism was really not being pushed much until recently. But those who advocate for those practices and those ideologies called for what they called tolerance. They just wanted to be accepted. After all, at least they claimed, they were not hurting anyone, so why can't we just accept the way they are, what they want to do, and just accept all of that? However, as their support has grown, they have become much more intolerant. That if you're a major league pitcher who expresses support for boycotts of pro-transgender companies, you'll be booed by your home fans, and before long, you'll even be cut from the team. If you're a baker who cannot in good conscience bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, then you'll be run out of business, or at least they'll try to do that. If you preach what the Bible teaches about homosexuality, you'll be labeled as a bigot and charged with using hate speech. This is not the first time when supporters of homosexuality were in a majority. As the wise man said in Ecclesiastes 1:9, there is nothing new under the sun. Notice the case of Lot in Sodom after he welcomed the two angels who came in the form of men, after he welcomed them into his house. Genesis 19, beginning in verse 4. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them." But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly." He goes on and says, "Only do nothing to these men inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand aside." Furthermore, they said, "This one came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them." So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. What happens when the acceptance of homosexuality or transgenderism, what happens when that grows? Notice what happened in that text that we just read. They will become more demanding, just as the men of Sodom demanded that Lot send out the men who came to his house. They will become more intolerant, just as the men of Sodom condemned Lot for judging them. And they will become violent, just as the men of Sodom tried to harm Lot for standing in the way of their sexual deviancy. And for more on those points, I have an article linked in the show notes called The Growing Acceptance of Homosexuality. It goes into that in more detail. Incidentally, I wrote that article back in 2008. And we can see now how far this has come in the last 15 years, where we have already reached this point, where advocates of homosexuality and now transgenderism in our society are becoming increasingly demanding, increasingly intolerant, and also violent. Remember the transgender shooter in Nashville? That's just one example of this. We discussed that in an episode a couple months ago. I'll link to that also in the show notes if you didn't hear that episode. But this is something that we need to be aware of, something that we need to be preparing for. And while we're still allowed to do it, we need to be encouraging our leaders to fulfill their God-given role to punish evildoers and protect the innocent, as Romans 13:3-4 says, rather than what they seem to be doing now of encouraging evildoers and enabling the harming of those who are innocent. So as our society has become increasingly godless, those who promote behaviors and lifestyles that pervert God's perfect design will become increasingly bold and intolerant of anyone who wants to stand for the truth on these issues. But we need to stand firm anyway. Truth does not change. The word of God, as the psalmist said, is forever settled in heaven. No matter what the consequences might be, we must not compromise the truth in order to appease a culture that has rejected God. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I hope you found it to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to the story we talked about, as well as other related materials, visit the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/061523. If you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or to share it with others that you think would be interested in this, then that is always appreciated. And if you're listening to this, remember that we are also uploading video versions of the podcast now to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So if you prefer video to the audio, then that option is there for you. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can see other videos that we post here from time to time. And if you see a news story or have some topic that you think would make for a good discussion, send that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.